Lawyers of victims of the 1998 bomb blast now want the Kenyan government to liaise with the US government to unlock challenges hindering the compensation of the victims. The lawyers, led by Philip Mussolino, urged the Senate Ad Hoc Committee on 1998 bomb blast to accompany them to Washington, D.C. in September to engage the US Senate in a bid to lobby for compensation.
We are thinking of September for this committee or representatives of this committee to come to Washington, and we need to start that process now. It helps to be able to persuade our friends that when they stand shoulder to shoulder with us, bad things happen, we will stand shoulder to shoulder with them. I said I'm not a supplicant, and my clients aren't supplicants. We're not begging the U.S. Senate or the House. We're asking them to do what we think is their obligation and what is their opportunity. But I am a supplicant here, and I'm asking you for your help for my clients. So please, if you can help, you're the ones who can get them the compensation that they haven't had for 24 years.
Now, the lead lawyer in the case seeking compensation for victims in the 1998 bombing attack at the Nairobi embassy, that is the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi then, which killed more than 200 people, has called on the Senate Ad Hoc Committee probing the compensation for victims of the attack to take up the matter with the United States Congress in order to fast-track compensation of victims. The new push for compensation of victims comes against the backdrop of the commemoration of the attack more than 2 decades later, with the victims receiving the short end of the stick. NTV's Melito Letenges now reports.
In an extensive report presented before the Senate Ad Hoc Committee on Compensation of Victims of the 1998 bomb attack, Philip Mussolino, an attorney with the U.S., elaborates his in and out of court battles, chasing after the wind in the corridors of justice in the United States.
And I can tell you now that the U.S. Congress doesn't listen to me. I'm just an American lawyer. They will listen to this committee, and they need to hear from this committee.
More than 2 decades later, since he started the quest for justice for victims of the attack, the U.S. government is yet to compensate them. Mussolino says it is not a battle he can win on his own, and that the Senate Ad Hoc Committee must take up the matter with the United States Congress. The case, which had been dragging for years, has also attracted the attention of human rights activists in the U.S. who have blamed the U.S. government for only compensating their own and leaving out Kenyans who suffered collateral damage when the U.S. Embassy was attacked, leaving more than 200 people dead. The Senate Ad Hoc Committee on Compensation of Victims of the Bomb Blast intends to pursue the compensation of victims through talks with the U.S. Congress, calling on the United States government to show commitment in settling the long-standing row.
That American government must walk the talk now and compensate these people so that they can at least live like people.
That we are not begging the American government. The reason why we are not begging is that we are looking at justice to Kenyans. Kenyans who got into a problem that they were not part of.
The new push for compensation by lawyers aims at prompting the U.S. Congress to include the Kenyan victims of terror in the Victims of Terror Fund in the U.S.
Been working on behalf of the Kenyan victims and survivors.
Lawyers representing victims of the August 7, 1998 bomb blast that targeted the U.S. Embassy in the heart of Nairobi presented their submissions before the Senate Ad Hoc Committee that is pushing for their compensation 25 years later.
When I saw the lifeless bodies of the Kenyans hanging from matatus, I was concerned about the issue of color. I was concerned whether or not the pace of the response would be sufficient.
Now, victims of the 1998 U.S. Embassy bomb blast in Nairobi, who were not employees of the United States, have dismissed claims that they were compensated by the U.S. government. The victims who met their lawyers Saturday morning said those who were compensated were Kenyans who were working at the U.S. Embassy and American citizens. And as Emily Chebet reports, there seems to be light at the end of the tunnel with the latest push.
When we see that, we get heartbroken. We sit back with a lot of anger and we look at ourselves as useless people, as sufferers, when the media or the newspapers are saying that we've been compensated. We've never been compensated.
To other news, lawyers of victims of the 1998 Nairobi bomb blast are currently holding a meeting with the Senate Ad Hoc Committee to plan the next move towards forcing the U.S. government to compensate them. The victims have been pushing to be compensated for the past 25 years. Senate committees are planning a visit to the U.S. in September to continue with the compensation push. Let's now cross over and listen in to the proceedings.
United States. It may be good for Kenya. I think it's good for Kenya. But I said constantly, I insist, because I've sued the United States for this, and I believe I'm right. And I believe if we went to a judge or a jury on the merits, we would have won a case on negligence against the United States, but we didn't get that opportunity. I believe the United States has an absolute obligation that it should have meant 24 years ago. It still has an obligation, but more important is it has an opportunity. And as the senator says, to walk the talk. We're all familiar with the new African policy in 2022, and it sounds great. It reads great. I think it's fantastic. But here is an opportunity for the United States to actually say, to actually do what it says is an American value, which I believe is an American value. To be stronger friends with Kenyans, to take care of the friends that we put in harm's way, and to not leave them behind. And I think it's when you say, what can the committee do? I think the committee's influence has already been shown on August 7th. And I don't have any doubt that when Senator Kavindu and the committee gets a chance to meet their counterparts in the Senate and the House face to face, I think Dr. Tasco and I and Caroline are just going to be on the sidelines cheering. Because I don't know who can say no to her or the committee, to be honest with you. And the fact of the matter is there's no reason for anyone in the Senate or the House or the President to oppose this legislation, because all it does is provide justice and fairness to people who are entitled to justice and fairness.
And lawyers representing victims of the 1998 U.S. Embassy bomb attack are now urging both the Kenyan and American government to use their foreign relations policy to end the 25-year agony for victims who are yet to be compensated. Appearing before the Senate Ad Hoc Committee that is pushing for the victims' compensation, lawyer Philip Musolino said there is a victim compensation fund set up by the U.S. Congress in 2014, but its wording does not include Kenyan victims. Musolino is urging the Kenyan government to face their U.S. counterparts to enable Kenyans benefit from the fund. Emily Chebet reports.
The issue of compensation of victims of the 1998 U.S. Embassy bomb attack in Nairobi has been a thorn in the flesh for the many victims and survivors of the horrendous attack by Al-Qaeda that saw over 200 people dead and thousands injured. For 25 years, the victims have been moving from one office to another, both in Kenya and the United States, with the hope of getting support that will enable them move on with their lives.
And for the last 4 years,
the victims' lawyers who appeared before the Senate Ad Hoc Committee that is pushing for their compensation says it is time to settle the matter once and for all.
Members of Congress don't care what I think. They're not interested in meeting me. They're not interested in talking to me. I'm just an American lawyer with Kenyan clients. But they are very much interested in what the Kenyan government has to say. They've made clear to us in the past that they're waiting to hear from the Kenyan government. My belief is that the reason Secretary Blinken was at the August 7 event for the first time, my belief is that that happened because of this committee.
According to Musolino, there is a victim compensation fund set up by the U.S. Congress in 2014, which is not limited to American victims. Instead, it applies to judgment holding victims of state-sponsored terrorist attacks directed against the United States. But Kenyan victims have not been included.
The victims who have been blinded, who lost their wives and who lost their husbands, if someone thinks some counseling fixed that problem, I have to firmly disagree. We haven't come close to doing for the victims by way of compensation what we do every day in American courtrooms, no matter who the defendant is. Big corporations, little corporations, United States, state agents, we do it all the time.
During the decades of litigation up to the United States Supreme Court, Mussolino's firm has managed to secure landmark rulings, including compensatory damages for each victim could fairly be calculated at $5 million in addition to punitive damages of $150 million. A bellwether hearing in which representative victims and experts testified would be applicable to non-testifying plaintiffs. That the attack was directed at the United States and its embassy and citizens, not at Kenya or its citizens. And forms filed by thousands of Kenyan victims within 1 year of bombing could be used as evidence in court. That the emotional and psychological damages, including fear and PTSD, were sustained by all victims.
That we're not just here saying the United States is rich, it should pay our poor clients. We're here saying the United States has an obligation to its friends and allies. When one of the reasons the friends and allies don't get to see the sunset for the last 24 years is because the United States did not do what it should have been doing at the time.
What is out there is, why are you fighting for them and Kenyan government is quiet? Few want to promise you and the rest of Americans that Kenyan government is not quiet. Kenyan government has stood now through the Senate, and even the president of this country is aware of what we are doing, and I know he's on board, even the opposition leaders, because this is an issue of Kenya, not any partisan issue.